Hey, what's good, y'all? This is Thawahgabar for Black Authentic Truth. Now, I have compiled a series of Black history stories for brothers and sisters to enjoy. Now, some of these stories will make you smile, but some of them may make you cry. But I guarantee you, you will leave away knowing something that you probably never knew before. Now, this is rated for elders and even children and everybody in between. So just sit back, relax, unwind, take a chill pill. Even if you fall asleep in the first 10 minutes like I could sometimes, it's all good. I hope you enjoy this compilation.
As a young black man, I have an obligation to my race of people, not to no other race or no other nationality, just to black people.
And you have always hated us. We have loved you consistently for 400 years. We prayed to that white Jesus, and we saluted your flag, and we died in your militaries, and you beat us like dogs.
Black History Month, also known as African American History Month in the U.S., is an annual observance in Canada, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and the United States. It began as a way for remembering important people and events in the history of the African diaspora. It is celebrated annually in the United States and Canada in February, as well as in the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and the Republic of Ireland in October. The precursor to Black History Month was created in 1926 in the United States, when historian Carter G. Woodson and the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History announced the second week of February to be Negro History Week. This week was chosen because it coincided with the birthday of Abraham Lincoln on February 12th and of Frederick Douglass on February 14th, both of which dates black communities had celebrated together since the late 19th century. From the event's initial phase, primary emphasis was placed on encouraging the coordinated teaching of the history of American blacks in the nation's public schools. The first Negro History Week was met with a lukewarm response, gaining the cooperation of the Departments of Education of the states of North Carolina, Delaware, and West Virginia, as well as the city school administrations of Baltimore and Washington, D.C. Despite this far from universal acceptance, the event was regarded by Woodson as one of the most fortunate steps ever taken by the association, and plans for a repeat of the event on an annual basis continued apace. By 1929, the Journal of Negro History was able to note that with only two exceptions, officials with the state departments of educations of every state with considerable Negro population had made the event known to that state's teachers and distributed official literature associated with the event. Churches also played a significant role in the distribution of literature in association with Negro History Week during the initial interval, with the mainstream and black press aiding in the publicity effort. Negro History Week was met with enthusiastic response. It prompted the creation of Black History Clubs, an increase in interest among teachers, and interest from progressive whites. Negro History Week grew in popularity throughout the following decades, with mayors across the United States endorsing it as a holiday. Black History Month was first proposed by black educators and the Black United Students at Kent State University in February 1969. The first celebration of Black History Month took place at Kent State 1 year later, the whole month of February in 1970. 6 years later, Black History Month was being celebrated all across the country in educational institutions, centers of black culture, and community centers both great and small. When President Gerald Ford recognized Black History Month during the celebration of the United States bicentennial, he urged Americans to, quote, seize the opportunity to honor the too often neglected accomplishments of black Americans in every area of endeavor throughout our history. What Carter G. Woodson would say about the continued celebrations of Black History Month is unknown, but he would smile on all the honest efforts to make black history a field of serious study and provide the public with thoughtful conversation and celebration. Slocum, Texas was largely African American, with several black citizens owning considerable amount of property, stores, and other businesses. This alone in parts of the South might have been enough to bring about violence, when a white man reportedly tried to collect a disputed debt from a well-regarded black citizen, a confrontation occurred, hard feelings lingered, and a prominent white citizen named James Spurger was infuriated and became an agitator. Many accounts report James Spurger instigated events by claiming he was threatened by blacks. Rumors spread of the Negro community and warnings of threats against white citizens and plans for race riots. And on July 29th, white hysteria transformed into bloodshed. Stoked and goaded by Spurger and others, a collection of white mobs made up of Slocum locals and heavily armed white residents from all over Anderson County roamed through the area in groups of 6 or 7 or in mobs of 30 to 40, and according to some reports, up to 200. They moved from road to road and cabin to cabin, shooting down Negroes in their tracks. Survivors of the bloodshed spread the word, and African Americans began fleeing. The white mobs followed blacks into the surrounding forests and marshes and shot many victims in the back as they fled. Several bodies were later discovered with personal possessions by their sides. A conservative estimate places the number killed at 18, while many men of standing in the community declared that no less than 40 were killed, but other accounts say more. No white man was injured in the so-called riot. During and afterward, many black residents fled the town, leaving behind real estate, homes, and other assets to save their lives. Their property was later seized by white residents. At least 13 other white men were arrested for the attacks, and Spurger and 6 others were indicted on 22 counts of murder. They were never tried. They were released without trial. A sheriff would later tell the New York Times, "These Negroes have done no wrong that I can discover. I don't know how many were in the mob, but there may have been 200 to 300. They hunted the Negroes down like sheep." On January 16, 2016, a state highway marker commemorating the victims was unveiled in a ceremony featuring their descendants and state officials. The marker was sought by Constance Holly Joade, a Dallas school district administrator whose great-grandfather, John Holly, was among the victims. He survived the massacre but fled with his family, losing his granary, dairy, and general store that he had developed since slavery.
My uncle Alex, he's out here somewhere. I want him found. My cousins are out here somewhere buried, like animals, and I want them found so my family can properly funeralize them. We were a proud people who owned businesses, a granary, a general store, a dairy, acres and acres of land. We were prosperous until the white surrounding community became envious and put a halt to our upward trajectory, economic trajectory.
This is the Slocum, Texas massacre. At the turn of the 19th century, the city of Brooklyn was known as the slave-holding capital of New York State and was home to the highest concentration of enslaved people north of the Mason-Dixon line. But after New York State abolished slavery in 1827, free black professionals bought land in what is now Crown Heights and founded Weeksville, a self-supporting community of African-American freedmen, which grew to become the second largest free black community in antebellum America. By 1855, over 520 free African Americans lived in Weeksville, including some of the leading activists in the abolitionist and equal suffrage movements. Weeksville was named after James Weeks, an African American stevedore from Virginia who in 1838, just 11 years after the abolition of slavery in New York State, bought a plot of land from Henry C. Thompson, a free African American and land investor in the 9th Ward of Central Brooklyn. There was ample opportunity for land acquisition during this time, as many prominent land-holding families sold off their properties during an intense era of land speculation. Many African Americans saw land acquisition as their opportunity to gain economic and political freedom by building their own communities. The village itself was established by a group of African American land investors and political activists and covered an area in the borough's East Bedford Hills area, bounded by present-day Fulton Street, East New York Avenue, Ralph Avenue, and Troy Avenue. By the 1850s, Weeksville had more than 500 residents from all over the East Coast, as well as 2 people born in Africa. Almost 40% of the residents were Southern-born. Nearly 1/3 of the men over 21 owned land. In antebellum New York, unlike New England, non-white men had to own real property to the value of $250 and pay taxes on it to qualify as voters. The village had its own churches and schools, a cemetery, and an old age home. Weeksville had one of the first African American newspapers, the Freedmen's Torchlight, and in the 1860s became the national headquarters of the African Civilization Society and the Howard Colored Orphan Asylum. During the violent New York draft riots of 1863, the community served as a refuge for many African Americans who fled from Manhattan. After the completion of the Brooklyn Bridge, and as New York City grew and expanded, Weeksville gradually became part of Crown Heights, and the memory of the village was largely forgotten. The 1968 discovery of the Hunterfly Roadhouses led to the formation of the Society for the Preservation of Weeksville History, now the Weeksville Heritage Center. In 1970, the houses were declared New York City landmarks, and in 1972 were placed on the National Register of Historic Places as the Hunterfly Road Historic District. The houses were rehabilitated in the 1980s, and after vandalism in the 1990s, following a $3 million restoration, the houses reopened to the public as the Weeksville Heritage Center, with each house showcasing a different era of Weeksville history. Known as Primer Libertador de America, or the first liberator of the Americas, Gaspar Yanga led one of colonial Mexico's first successful slave uprisings and would go on to establish one of the America's earliest free black settlements. He was a man who would be no person's slave. Rumored to be one of the royal lineage from West Africa, Yanga was an enslaved worker in the sugarcane plantations of Veracruz, Mexico. In 1570, he, along with a group of Maroon followers, escaped, fled to the mountainous regions near Cordoba, and established a settlement of former slaves called Palenque. Though it is poorly documented, we know Palenque life was simple: substance farming and religion that was heavily influenced by the Negro slaves. The location gave Yanga's groups relative safety and for 30 years served as a safe haven for escaped slaves. Given that the colony couldn't engage in commerce with other villages and merchants, Yanga's group targeted caravans on the Royal Road, which ran from Veracruz to Mexico. Taking the role of spiritual and military leader, he structured the agricultural community in an ordered capacity, allowing its growth and occupation of various locations. Hiding out in New Spain's coastland highlands, the people of Yanga's settlements would attack merchants and armed military alike with crude weapons and strategy. Perceived as dangerous to the colonial system of slavery through their daring actions against royal commerce and authority, New Spain called for the annihilation of Yanga's Palenque. Destroying the community and its leader would send a message to other would-be rebellious slaves that Spain's authority over them was absolute. The Spanish couldn't beat Yanga though. They tried. He was embarrassing the crown. In 1609, Spanish authorities sent a well-armed militia to defeat Yanga and his men. Yanga attempted to broker a treaty. Spanish commander Pedro González de Herrera refused the terms, and a bloody battle followed at the Rio Blanco. The Spanish burned down a primary Yanga settlement. Since most of the Maroons managed to escape into the woods and brush, the battle was essentially a draw. The Spanish were stuck in a deadlock with the Maroons for years and agreed to meet with Yanga forces. Yanga offered to make peace, but with certain terms, the most important being recognition of the freedom of all the Palenque's residents prior to 1608. The acknowledgement of the settlement as a legal entity which Yanga and his descendants would govern, and the prohibition of any Spanish in the community. Yanga in turn promised to serve and pay tribute to the Spanish crown. After years of negotiations, in 1618, the town of San Lorenzo de los Negros was officially recognized by Spanish authorities as a free black settlement. It would later be referred to as Yanga, named after its founder, Gaspar Yanga. This is the story of Gaspar Yanga. When basketball legend Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was asked who was the greatest player he ever played against, after a long and illustrious NBA career playing against many of the legends of the sport, he gave a surprising answer. That would have to be the GOAT. A man who has variously been described by players and sports writers alike as the greatest basketball player to never play in the NBA. Although he was relatively small at 6 feet 1 inch, Earl Manigault boasted a 52-inch vertical, His remarkable leaping ability allowed him to soar over taller opponents, as well as an array of flashy moves under the basket. In legendary matchups against other city stars like Alcindor, known as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Connie Hawkins, and Joe the Destroyer Hammond, Manigault helped enhance New York's playground legend as a breeding ground for young stars. There weren't too many little guys back then soaring to the hoop and dunking on and blocking the shots of guys 6'9" and 6'10", Manigault said in an interview. I was a pioneer in that sense. That's why I became so popular. Manigault, nicknamed the GOAT, due to one of his teachers mispronouncing his last name as Manigault, was famous for his mid-air acrobatics. Thousands of people swear they saw him perform a move known as the double dunk, in which he would slam the ball through a net, catch it as it dropped through the cords, and still airborne, dunk it again. He once dunked a ball 36 times in a row to win a $60 bet. While Abdul-Jabbar was making a name for himself as an all-city basketball player at Power Memorial High School in Midtown, Manigault became a star at Benjamin Franklin High School in Harlem. But in his senior year, he was kicked out of school for not going to class and allegedly smoking marijuana. He spent one season at Laurinburg Institute, a North Carolina prep school, where he drew the attention of schools like North Carolina, Duke, and Indiana. Feeling he would not be able to meet the academic requirements of such schools, Manigault chose instead to attend Johnson C. Smith University, a predominantly black school in Charlotte, North Carolina. The move backfired. Manigault continued to struggle academically, squabbled with his coach about playing time, and returned to the playgrounds of New York, where a heroin addiction slowly began to destroy his great athletic ability. Growing up, Kareem and I were very close, Manigault said. We both had talent, and we both ended up taking separate roads in life. Abdul-Jabbar believes the fault isn't all Manigault's. Most black people never see any type of success, he said. People in Earl's position see the system is not going to give him a break. Earl fell victim to that. There's no family structure to give you the support you need. I had that, and Earl didn't. I certainly didn't have the basketball talent over Earl. After many hardships, Earl overcame his life for drugs to make a better life for his family. Much of his later years were dedicated to working with kids on the court. He restarted the GOAT tournament, as well as the Walk Away from Drugs tournament, aimed at getting kids that were on drugs off of drugs, as well as trying to prevent others from ever starting. He also got a job at East Harlem's LaGuardia Memorial House as a counselor to kids. He was a selfless person that did a lot for his community. Sadly, Earl died in 1998 in a Manhattan hospital due to congestive heart failure. He was 53 years old. This is the story of playground legend, Earl the GOAT Manigault. Mariette Monier Lewis, also known as Wildfire, was an extraordinary talented sculptor with an interesting story. She was of Native American and Black descent, her mother being of Chippewa and her father Haitian. Both died when she was young. Historians have found it hard to pinpoint her date of birth, so many details remain unknown about this amazing talent. She and her half-brother Samuel were raised by their aunts. They would travel to places like Niagara Falls, Toronto, Canada, and Buffalo, New York, selling native Indian baskets and moccasins to tourists to make a living. In 1852, her brother Samuel set off for California during the gold rush, eventually becoming successful and was able to finance her education. In 1856, Lewis enrolled in a Baptist abolitionist school, but left 3 years later, having been declared to be wild. But records show that she had exemplary conduct, grades, and attendance at Central College. Her classes included Latin, French, grammar, arithmetic, drawing, composition, and public speaking. She later attended Oberlin College in Ohio, where she experienced daily racism. She was accused of poisoning 2 classmates that she boarded with. After serving them both drinks, apparently they became very ill. One night, while walking home, she was dragged into an open field and beaten horribly by a white mob and left for dead. Soon after this incident, she was found innocent of poisoning the girls due to a lack of evidence. In 1864, she moved to Boston to pursue a career as a sculptor. Her keeps introduced her to already established sculptors in the area, as well as abolitionist writers featuring her in their newsletters. Edward Augustus Brackett, an established marble sculptor, agreed to instruct her. Under his instruction, she made her own sculpting tools and sold her first sculpture of a woman's hand for $8. Soon after, she opened her own solo studio. She took a liking and was inspired by great abolitionists and Civil War heroes, and her pieces commonly depicted busts of these types. Her early famous piece was a bust of Robert Gauld Shaw, the commander of an African-American Civil War regiment from Massachusetts. Lewis was interviewed and written about by many prominent abolitionists of her time. She was featured in abolitionist newsletters such as The Broken Fetter, The Christian Register, and The Independent. With the small success and money she made from selling her sculptures, she moved to Rome. I was practically driven to Rome to obtain the opportunities for art culture and to find a social atmosphere where I was not constantly reminded of my color. The land of liberty had no room for a colored sculptor. She had to be conscious of her artwork. The consumers of her art were white, and in order to please them, her pieces commonly depicted European features, although telling stories of Native Indian and Black people. She had to balance her personal identity with her profession and who she was to the public. She was the first Native Indian/Black sculptor, male or female, to gain international acclaim in Western sculptural tradition. In Rome, she was introduced to a group of artists and established her own space in 18th century Italian sculptor Antonio Canova's former studio, where she received a lot of professional support. Italy was not as racist as America and gave her better opportunities as a Black artist. There, she had more spiritual and social freedom to be who she wanted to be. Most of her adult years were spent in Italy. In 1873, a New Orleans newspaper stated that she had profited from two $50,000 commissions. Her popularity grew and her studio soon became a tourist attraction. She had many exhibitions, and in her work, she expressed her Native Indian and Black heritage. Forever Free, one of her more known works, depicts a Black man and woman breaking the yoke of slavery. Another one, called The Arrow Maker, depicts a father showing his daughter how to make an arrow. By the late 1880s, her style of artwork was on a decline in popularity. She continued to make her pieces for various patrons in Italy. In 1877, former President Ulysses S. Grant commissioned her for a portrait and was impressed with the final result. Frederick Douglass also came to visit her in Rome. She moved to London, and not much is known of her in her later years. She never married and had no children. She announced an engagement in 1873, only revealing that the man was of the same color as her, but nothing else was ever heard from it. She is quoted as saying, "Some praise me because I am a colored girl. I don't want that kind of praise. I had rather you would point out my defects, for that will teach me something." Mary Edmonia Lewis died on September 17, 1907 in the Hammersmith Borough Infirmary. She was buried in St. Mary's Roman Catholic Cemetery in London. In 2017, a GoFundMe made by Bobby Reno, a New York historian, was successful in raising money to restore Edmonia Lewis's grave. This is the story of a wildfire burning a path through the forest, a visionary, an amazing talent, known to the world as Mary Edmonia Lewis.
Gordon, or Whip Peter, was an enslaved African American who escaped from a Louisiana plantation in March 1863, gaining freedom when he reached a Union camp near Baton Rouge. Upon learning of his escape, his master recruited several neighbors, and together they chased after him with a pack of bloodhounds. Gordon had anticipated that he would be pursued and carried with him onions from the plantation, which he rubbed on his body to throw off the dog's scent. Such resourcefulness worked, and Gordon, his clothes torn and his body covered with mud and dirt, reached the safety of Union soldiers stationed at Baton Rouge 10 days later. He had traveled approximately 80 miles. While at this encampment, Gordon decided to enlist in the Union Army, as President Lincoln had granted African Americans the opportunity to serve in segregated units only months earlier. Gordon was at the front of a movement that would ultimately involve nearly 200,000 African Americans. It was during this medical examination, prior to being mustered into the Army, that military doctors discovered the extensive scars on his back. Not much is known about Gordon aside from the testimony he gave the medical examiners and the image of his back and the keloid scars he suffered from his beating. He told examiners that he had left the plantation 10 days ago and that the man who whipped him was the plantation's overseer. After the whipping, he was told he had become sort of crazy and had threatened his wife. As he lay in bed recovering, the plantation owner fired the overseer, but Gordon had already determined in his mind to escape when he was able. A sergeant with the 30th Regiment of the Massachusetts Volunteers sent a copy of the photograph to the Surgeon General of the state of Massachusetts. In his accompanying letter, he wrote, "Few sensation writers ever depicted worse punishments than this man must have received. Though nothing in his appearance indicates any unusual viciousness, but on the contrary, he seems intelligent and well behaved. Within months, commercial photographers in Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and London were issuing this image on their own studio mounts. Recognized as a searing indictment of slavery, Gordon's portrait was presented as the latest evidence in the abolitionist campaign. An unidentified writer for the New York Independent wrote, "This card photograph should be multiplied by 100,000 and scattered over the states. It tells the story in a way that even Miss Harriet Beecher, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, cannot approach, because it tells the story to the eyes." Records of Gordon's military service during the Civil War are incomplete. Harper's Weekly reported that he served as a Union guide in Louisiana and that during one expedition, he was taken captive by Confederate forces, beaten, and left for dead. Yet he supposedly survived and returned to the Union lines. The Liberator reported that he served as a sergeant in an African-American regiment that fought bravely at the siege of Port Hudson, an important Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River, 20 miles north of Baton Rouge. There are no further records indicating what became of Gordon, yet this famous image of him lives on as a searing testament of slavery's brutality and the fortitude, bravery, and courage displayed by so many African Americans during this time period. This is the story of Gordon, also known as Whipped Peter.
Black problems, black issues, past, present, and future. This is Black Authentic Truth. Bill Bojangles Robinson was the most famous of all African-American tap dancers in the 20th century. Born Luther Robinson in Richmond, Virginia on May 25, 1878. His father, Maxwell, worked in a machine shop while his mother, Maria, was a choir singer. Maria and Maxwell Robinson died in 1885. Robinson was raised by his grandmother, Bedelia, who had been a slave earlier in her life. According to Robinson, he used physical force to compel his brother Bill to switch names with him, since he did not care for his given name of Luther. He got the nickname Bojangles from jangler, meaning contentious, and he invented the phrase, "everything's copacetic," meaning tip-top. At the age of 5, Robinson began dancing for a living, performing in local beer gardens. At the age of 9, he joined Mamie Remington's touring troupe. In 1891, he joined a traveling company, later performing as a vaudeville act. He achieved great success as a nightclub and musical comedy performer. At this stage of his career, he performed almost exclusively in black theaters before black audiences, developing his solo act. He took a break from performing to serve as a rifleman in World War I. Along with fighting in the trenches, Robinson was also a drum major who led the regimental band up Fifth Avenue upon the regiment's return from Europe. Robinson transitioned to Broadway and to Hollywood films in the 1930s and 1940s. His delicate tap dance style and cheerful demeanor made Robinson a favorite of both black and white audiences. He could light up a room with his smile. In 1928, he starred on Broadway in the hugely successful musical revue, Blackbirds of 1928, which featured his famous stair dance. Blackbirds was a revue starring African-American performers intended for white audiences. The show was a breakthrough for Robinson. He became well known as Bojangles, which connoted a cheerful and happy-go-lucky demeanor for his white fans. Despite the nearly polar opposite meaning of the nickname in the black community, his catchphrase, "everything's copacetic," reinforced Robinson's sunny disposition. Although he worked regularly as an actor, Robinson was best known for his tap dance routines. He pioneered a new form of tap, shifting from a flatfoot style to a light swinging style that focused on elegant footwork.
He starred in 14 Hollywood motion pictures, many of them musicals, and played multiple roles opposite the child star Shirley Temple. His film credits include Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm, The Little Colonel, and Stormy Weather, co-starring Lena Horne and Cab Calloway. Despite his fame, Robinson was not able to transcend a narrow range of stereotypical roles written for black actors at the time. By accepting these roles, Robinson was able to maintain steady employment and remain in the public eye. Robinson celebrated his 61st birthday publicly by dancing down 61 blocks of Broadway. Robinson was married 3 times. His 1907 marriage to Lena Chase ended in 1922. He married his second wife, Fannie S. Clay, in 1922. Clay served as her husband's manager and assisted him in founding the Negro Actors Guild of America, which advocated for the rights of African American performers. Clay and Robinson divorced in 1943. In 1944, he married Elaine Plains. Robinson and Plains were together until Robinson's death in 1949. Bill Robinson was involved in baseball as well as theater. In 1936, he co-founded the New York Black Yankees team based in Harlem with financier James Selmer. Robinson died in 1949 at the age of 71 due to heart failure. After a series of heart attacks, his doctor advised him to quit in 1948. Robinson maintained that though he had trouble walking, talking, sleeping, and breathing, when he danced, he felt wonderful. He was virtually poor when he died. Much of his wealth went to charities in Harlem and helping random people on hard times. Robinson's funeral, arranged by longtime friend and television host Ed Sullivan, was held at the 369th Infantry Regiment Armory and attended by thousands, including many stars from the entertainment industry. A eulogy by Adam Clayton Powell Sr. was broadcast over the radio. Robinson was buried in the Cemetery of the Evergreens in Brooklyn, New York. On June 30th, 1973, his hometown of Richmond, Virginia, erected a statue in honor of the legend. Robinson remained a well-known figure after his death, particularly in dance circles. In 1989, a joint congressional resolution established National Tap Day on May 25th, Robinson's birthday. Additionally, a public park in Harlem bears Robinson's name, a way of honoring his charitable contributions and participation in community life. This is the story of Bill Bojangles Robinson. Henrietta Lacks was born in Virginia and worked as a tobacco farmer, later moving her family to Baltimore for a better life. Henrietta had been feeling pain, and after her 5th child was born, she went to the hospital to find out the reason for the pain. She was diagnosed with cervical cancer. Upon examination, Dr. Howard Jones discovered a large malignant tumor on her cervix. At the time, the Johns Hopkins Hospital was one of only a few hospitals to treat poor African Americans. Henrietta was told of the cancer, and without her knowledge and consent, a sample of her tissues were taken and later passed to George Otto Gay, a cancer and virus researcher. Lacks would die a horrible death a short time later at the age of 31, her body ravaged by those rapidly spreading cancer cells. Her cells turned out to be something never seen before. They doubled every 20 to 25 hours, reproducing indefinitely. Nicknamed HeLa cells, for the first 2 letters of her first and last name. It was a breakthrough in medicine because cells were never known to live outside the body like the HeLa cells did. These cells from a black woman would revolutionize modern medicine. The HeLa cell has contributed to many medical breakthroughs, from the development of the polio vaccine to the study of leukemia and other cancers, the AIDS virus, the effects of zero gravity in outer space, and the effects of radioactivity. All these health milestones and many more owe everything to the life of Henrietta Lacks. Millions of lives have benefited and have been saved because of her cells. The Lacks family was not made aware of their mother's cells until 1975, almost 25 years after she had died. HeLa cells were the first human biological materials ever bought and sold, which helped launch a multi-billion-dollar industry. When Henrietta's children found out that people were selling vials of their mother's cells and that their family didn't get any of the resulting money, they got very angry. Henrietta's family had lived in poverty most of their lives, and many of them couldn't afford health insurance. So their family launched a campaign to get some of what they felt they were owed financially. They were told the statute of limitations for malpractice had expired. Meanwhile, billions of dollars have been made off the cells of their mother. In 2013,
the National Institute of Health announced that 2 members of the Lacks family would sit on the panel that would control access to the HeLa cells. However, the agreement did not include financial compensation for Lacks' descendants. Her family also never received any money from the bestseller book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, written by Rebecca Skloot with the help of Deborah Lacks, a daughter of Henrietta Lacks who passed in 2009, or the HBO movie on Henrietta's life, both of which have profited. A building expected to open in 2022 on Johns Hopkins University East Baltimore campus will be named for Henrietta Lacks, whose cells were taken without her consent and widely used in revolutionary research. In 2010, a headstone for Henrietta's unmarked grave was donated. The headstone of Henrietta Lacks is shaped like a book and contains these words: Henrietta Lacks, born August 1st, 1920, died October 4th, 1951. In loving memory of a phenomenal woman, wife, and mother who touched the lives of many, here lies Henrietta Lacks, HeLa. Her immortal cells will continue to help mankind forever. Eternal love and admiration from your family. Henrietta Lacks died in 1951, and in a very tangible way, she still lives on today. Henrietta Lacks, DNA of the Gods. Shows were performed in the 1830s in New York by white performers with blackened faces, mostly using burnt cork and shoe polish and tattered clothing, who imitated and mimicked enslaved black people on southern plantations. These performances characterized blacks as lazy, ignorant, superstitious, hypersexual, happy-go-lucky, and prone to thievery and cowardice. Thomas Dartmouth Rice, known as the father of minstrelsy, developed the first known blackface character, Jim Crow, in 1830. By 1845, the popularity of the minstrel had spawned an entertainment sub-industry, manufacturing songs and sheet music, makeup, and costumes, as well as a ready set of stereotypes upon which to build new performances. Several characters in minstrel shows became archetypes, from Jump Jim Crow to the jazz singer. Some of the most famous ones were Rice's Jim Crow, a rural dancing fool in tattered clothing, the Mammy, an overweight and loud mother figure, and Zip Coon, a flamboyantly dressed man who used sophisticated words incorrectly. Blackface performances grew particularly popular between the end of the Civil War and the turn of the century in northern and midwestern cities, where regular interaction with African Americans was limited. Blackface minstrelsy was the first theatrical form that was distinctly American. During the 1830s and the 1840s, at the height of its popularity, it was at the epicenter of the American music industry. For several decades, it provided the means through which American whites viewed black people. White racial animosity grew following the Emancipation Proclamation, when antebellum stereotypes collided with actual African Americans and their demands for full citizenship, including the right to vote. The influence of minstrelsy and racial stereotyping on American society cannot be overstated. New media ushered minstrel performances from the stage, across radio and television airwaves, and into theaters. Popular American actors, including Shirley Temple, Judy Garland, and Mickey Rooney, donned blackface, bridging the minstrel performance across generations and making it a family amusement. The minstrel genre has had a lasting legacy and influence and was featured in a television series as recently as 1975. Generally, as the civil rights movement progressed and gained acceptance, minstrels lost popularity. Blackface and the codifying of blackness, language, movement, deportment, and character as caricature persist through mass media and in public performances still to this day.
And to this day,
In addition to the increased popularity of black Halloween costumes, colleges and universities across the country continue to battle against student and professor blackface performances. In each instance, those facing scrutiny for blackface performances insist no malice or racial hatred was intended. This ignorance and racial insensitivity concerning the history of minstrelsy is an ongoing problem, not only in America, but in the whole world. And this is why this video is important. So in the future, we don't have another "I didn't mean to offend anyone" moment. This is Black Authentic Truth. Bridget Mason, known to everyone as Biddy, was born in slavery on August 15, 1818 on a plantation in Hancock, Georgia. As a child, she was separated from her parents and sold several times, working on plantations in Georgia, Mississippi, and South Carolina. She spent much of her childhood working on John Smithton's plantation in South Carolina, where she assisted the house servants and midwives. During her teenage years, she learned domestic and agricultural skills. Additionally, she developed skills in herbal medicine and midwifery. These skills were passed down from slave women, Caribbean, and Native American traditions. Her knowledge benefited both the slaves and the plantation owners. According to some stories, Smithton gave the 18-year-old Biddy to his cousins Robert Marion Smith and Rebecca Crosby Smith around 1836 as a wedding present. But records are not clear as to why she moved to the Smiths' plantation in Logtown, Mississippi. Also, she was very valuable to the Smiths because of her knowledge of medicine, child care, and livestock care. While on the Smiths' plantation, Biddy had 3 daughters between 1838 and 1847, Ellen, Anne, and Harriet. The father or fathers of her children are unknown, but some historians believe Robert Smith likely fathered at least one of her children. A 25-year-old slave named Hannah worked with Biddy on the plantation, and like Biddy, Hannah also had 3 children. The Smiths converted to the Mormon religion, and in 1847, Robert Smith moved his extended family and slaves equaling 90 people in all from Mississippi to Utah territory. There he would help establish a Mormon community in which would become Salt Lake City, Utah. At this time, Utah was still part of Mexico. Mason, then 30, walked 1,700 miles behind her master's 300-wagon caravan for 7 months as they moved to the Salt Lake area of Utah. The caravan eventually arrived in the Holiday Cottonwood area of Salt Lake Valley. Along the route, Mason was responsible for setting up and breaking down camp, cooking the meals, herding cattle, and serving as a midwife. She also took care of her 3 young daughters, aged 10, 4, and her newborn in which she carried on her back. Church leader Brigham Young sent a group of Mormons to San Bernardino, California to establish another community in 1851. Smith decided to join them. Young instructed the group that California was a free state and that their slaves would be free when they arrived in California, but Smith ignored Young and chose not to free Biddy or Hannah. Biddy was among a large group of slaves in the San Bernardino settlement. She wanted to be free, but was ignorant of the laws and her rights. And over 4 years, she had made many friends in the extended community. In 1855, Smith decided to move his family and his slaves to the slave state of Texas. He planned to settle there or sell his slaves and make a profit. Biddy relayed her fears of remaining a slave to 2 free black men, Charles Owens and Manuel Pepper, both whom were courting Biddy and Hannah's daughters, and they were determined to help Biddy stay in California. Robert Owens, the father of Charles Owens and a successful businessman, persuaded the county sheriff to prevent Smith from taking his slaves out of the state. The sheriff kept Smith's slaves in the county jail for their protection until their legal status could be determined. Robert Owens filed a petition claiming that Smith was illegally holding his slaves in a free state. The case was heard in the United States District Court of Appeals. Legal counsel for the slaves was financed by the Los Angeles black community. Since California law at the time prohibited blacks from testifying in court, Biddy could not speak on her own behalf, but the judge met with her privately to hear her story. Robert Smith claimed that they were not slaves but members of his family. After Smith failed to appear in court on January 21, 1856, the judge presiding over the case, Benjamin Ignatius Hayes, freed Biddy and her family members. The ruling freed Mason and 13 members of her extended family. In 1860, Mason received a certified copy of the document that guaranteed her freedom. Biddy had no legal last name when she was enslaved, so she took the last name Mason from the mayor of San Bernardino, who was also a Mormon apostle. Mason moved her family to LA and she continued to work as a midwife and nurse, saving her money and using it to purchase land in what is now the heart of downtown Los Angeles. There she organized First AME Church, the oldest African-American church in the city. Mason used her wealth, estimated to be about $3 million, to become a philanthropist to the entire LA community. She donated to numerous charities, fed and sheltered the poor, and visited prisoners. Mason was instrumental in founding a Travelers Aid Center, and an elementary school for black children. Because of her kind and giving spirit, many called her Grandma Mason. Needy people often lined up in front of her house. One source says she also ran an orphanage in her house. Bridget Biddy Mason died in LA on January 15, 1891 at the age of 73. She was buried in an unmarked grave in Evergreen Cemetery in the Boyle Heights area of Los Angeles. On March 27, 1988, the mayor of LA and members of the church she founded held a ceremony in which her grave was marked with a tombstone. A year later, November 16, 1989, was declared Biddy Mason Day in Los Angeles. The next day, a new mixed-use building called the Broadway Spring Center was opened on the spot where Mason's homestead once stood. The site includes an 8 by 81-foot memorial wall dedicated to Mason that includes a collage of her original frame house. This is the story of Bridget Biddy Mason. Isaac Woodard enlisted in the U.S. Army on October 14, 1942. He served in the Pacific Theater in a labor battalion as a longshoreman and was promoted to sergeant. He earned a battle star for his service from unloading ships under enemy fire in New Guinea, and on February 12, 1946, he received his honorable discharge. On the same day, the 26-year-old Woodard, still in uniform, was on a Greyhound bus traveling from Camp Gordon in Augusta, Georgia, to South Carolina to pick up his wife and then go to New York City with her to visit his parents. As they made a stop in North Carolina, he asked the bus driver if there was any time to use the restroom. The driver cursed at Woodard and said no. Woodard cursed back, and the driver said go and hurry up. Woodard went and used the restroom and got back on the bus. At the next stop in Batesburg, South Carolina, the driver contacted the chief of police, Linwood Scholl, who forcibly removed Woodard from the bus. After demanding to see his discharge papers, a number of policemen, including Scholl, took Woodard to a nearby alley where they beat him repeatedly with nightsticks. And after that, they took Woodard to the town jail and arrested him for disorderly conduct, accusing him of drinking beer in the back of the bus with other soldiers. During the course of the night in jail, Scholl beat and blinded Woodard. Woodard would later state in court that he beat him for saying yes instead of yes, sir. Woodard also suffered partial amnesia as a result of his injuries. Woodard stated that he was punched in the eyes by the police several times on the way to jail and later repeatedly jabbed his eyes with a billy club. Newspaper reports indicate that Woodard's eyes had been gouged out, and documents indicate that each eyeball was ruptured irreparably in the socket. The following morning, the police sent Woodard before the local judge, who found him guilty and fined him $50 as the soldier requested medical assistance. It took 2 more days for a doctor to be sent to him. Not knowing where he was and suffering from amnesia, Woodard ended up in the hospital in Aiken, South Carolina, receiving substandard medical care. 3 weeks after he was reported missing by his relatives, Woodard was discovered in the hospital, and he was immediately rushed to the U.S. Army Hospital in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Though his memory had begun to recover, by that time, doctors found that both his eyes were damaged beyond repair. On October 2nd, Scholl and several of his officers were indicted in the U.S. District Court of Columbia, South Carolina. The local U.S. attorney charged with handling the case failed to interview anyone except the bus driver. The presiding judge over the case later wrote of being disgusted at the way the case was handled at the local level. The defense did not perform any better
When the defense attorney began to shout racial epithets at Woodard, the presiding judge stopped him immediately. After Woodard gave his account of the events, Scholl firmly denied it. He claimed that Woodard had threatened him with a gun and that Scholl had used his billy club to defend himself. During this testimony, Scholl admitted that he repeatedly struck Woodard in the eyes on November 5th. After 30 minutes of deliberation, the all-white jury found Scholl not guilty on all charges, despite him admitting that he blinded Woodard. The courtroom broke into applause upon hearing the verdict. This verdict brought about the desegregation of the U.S. military enacted by President Truman at that time. Scholl was never punished, dying in Batesburg, South Carolina, at the good old age of 95 on December 27, 1997. Isaac Woodard moved north after the trial during the Second Great Migration and lived in the New York City area for the rest of his life. He died at the age of 73 in the Veterans Administration Hospital in the Bronx on September 23, 1992. He was buried with military honors at the Calverton National Cemetery in Calverton, New York on Saturday, February 9, 2019. A commemorative historical marker was dedicated to Isaac Woodard in Batesburg, Leesville, South Carolina, with the bottom portion of the marker written in Braille. This is the story of Isaac Woodard.
Lewis Howard Latimer was an African-American inventor and patent draftsman for the light bulb and telephone. Latimer also developed a forerunner of the air conditioner called the apparatus for cooling and disinfecting. In 1884, he was invited to work with Thomas Edison, and along with the work he did with Edison, he was also responsible for translating data into German and French, as well as gathering that information. He was an expert witness in patent litigation on electric lights. While at Edison, Latimer wrote the first book on electric lighting, entitled Incandescent Electric Lighting, in 1890. George Washington Carver was an African-American agricultural scientist and inventor. He actively promoted alternative crops to cotton and methods to prevent soil depletion. Sarah Breedlove, known as Madam C.J. Walker, was an African-American entrepreneur, philanthropist, and political and social activist. Walker made her fortune by developing and marketing a line of cosmetic and hair care products for Black women through the business she founded, Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company. Elijah J. McCoy was an African-American inventor and engineer who was notable for his 57 U.S. patents, most having to do with the lubrication of steam engines. Lonnie George Johnson, an African-American inventor and engineer who holds more than 120 patents. He is the inventor of the Super Soaker water gun, which has been among the world's best-selling toys ever since its release. Patricia Era Bath was an African-American ophthalmologist, inventor, humanitarian, and academic. She was an early pioneer of laser cataract surgery. Bath was the first African-American woman doctor to receive a patent for a medical purpose, the holder of 5 patents. Granville Taylor Woods was an African-American inventor who held more than 60 patents. One of his notable inventions was the multiplex telegraph, a device that sent messages between train stations and moving trains. His work assured a safer and better public transportation system for the cities of the United States. Frederick McKinley Jones was an African-American inventor, entrepreneur, and winner of the National Medal of Technology and an inductee of the National Inventors Hall of Fame. His innovations in refrigeration brought great improvement to the long-haul transportation of perishable goods. He co-founded Thermo King. Benjamin Banneker was an African-American almanac author, surveyor, naturalist, and farmer. He is known for being part of the group led by Major Andrew Ellicott that surveyed the original borders of the District of Columbia, the federal capital district of the United States. Banneker's knowledge of astronomy helped him author a commercially successful series of almanacs. Thomas L. Jennings was an African-American tradesman and abolitionist in New York City, New York. He operated and owned a tailoring business. In 1821, he was one of the first African-Americans to be granted a patent for his method of dry cleaning. With the proceeds of his invention, he bought his wife and children's freedom, then continued his civil rights work. Sarah Boone was an African-American inventor who on April 26, 1892, obtained United States patent rights for her improvements to the ironing board. Boone's ironing board was designed to improve the quality of ironing sleeves and the bodies of women's garments. Otis Frank Boykin was an African-American inventor and engineer. He holds the patents for 28 electronic devices. One of his early inventions was an improved wire resistor, which had reduced inductance and reactance due to the physical arrangement of the wire. Other notable inventions include a variable resistor used in guided missiles. His most famous invention was likely a control unit for the artificial cardiac pacemaker. The device essentially uses electrical impulses to maintain a regular heartbeat. Jan Ernst Manselinger was an African-American inventor whose lasting machine brought significant change to the manufacturing of shoes. Manselinger obtained a patent for his invention of an automatic shoe laster in 1883. A skilled hand laster could produce 50 pairs in a 10-hour day. Manselinger's machine could produce between 150 and 700 pairs of shoes a day, cutting shoe prices across the nation in half. Alexander Miles was an African-American inventor, best known for being awarded patents for automatically opening and closing elevator doors. He was awarded the patent in October 11, 1887. Percy Levon Julian was an African-American research chemist and a pioneer in chemical synthesis of medicinal drugs from plants. His work laid the foundation for the steroid drugs industry production of cortisone and other cortisoid steroids and birth control pills. Julian received more than 130 chemical patents.
George Washington was an American political leader, military general, and founding father who served as the first president of the United States from 1789 to 1797. At the end of his life, George Washington also made the controversial decision to free the legal portion of Mount Vernon's enslaved people. However, as a slaveholder, George Washington also followed the standards of his time. He condoned and even encouraged violence as a way to keep enslaved people subservient. From age 11 until his death at 67, Washington and his wife had slaves. He had a habit of being an unsanitary man and issued dirty, foul, and manure-soaked wool from the stomachs of sheep for clothing for his slaves. His slaves also lived in miserable conditions. Award-winning author and historian Henry Winesek stated during a 2003 radio interview, Washington's slaves were miserably clothed. In fact, they were so badly clothed that they were still in the wheat sacks made of the cheapest, roughest burlap to repair their own clothes. Otherwise, they would go around in rags. On April 30th, 1789, the date of his presidential inauguration, although he had mostly dentures, he had only one remaining natural tooth, a premolar, in which he gave to his dentist as a gift. During that same year, he began wearing full dentures from teeth that were yanked from the heads of slaves. Yes, teeth that came from slaves. His diary regularly mentioned troubles such as aching teeth and lost teeth. John Adams says he lost his teeth because he used them to crack Brazil nuts, but modern historians suggest mercury oxide, which he was given to treat illnesses such as smallpox and malaria, probably contributed to the loss during his lifetime. He had at least 4 sets of dentures made to replace them. Although many believe they were made of wood, they were actually made of other materials such as hippopotamus ivory, brass, gold, and human teeth. The dentures had metal fasteners, springs to force them open, as well as bolts to keep them together. The only existing complete set of Washington's dentures are owned by the Mount Vernon's Lady Association, who own and operate George Washington's estate in Northern Virginia. That set is made of human teeth, animal teeth, and ivory. There is another complete original lower jaw denture dated 1795 at the National Museum of Dentistry in Baltimore. Lund Washington, George's distant cousin who managed Mount Vernon during the Revolution, made a notation in the plantation ledger books for May 1784 which reads, "By cash paid Negroes for 9 teeth on account of Dr. John Le Mayor, George Washington's dentist." Although it may seem honorable that cash was paid to slaves for their teeth, it is more likely that these slaves were owned by another slave master, and that slave master would have wanted compensation for the loss of his slaves' teeth. Slaves were property and had no rights, and Washington would not be obligated to pay his slaves for teeth, being that they were his property, and they would be in no position to refuse him. American history would naturally downplay such detestable and horrible acts attributed to the first president of the United States. But when stepping back and taking a look at the history of slavery in America, should we be surprised? This is Black Authentic Truth.